Hermann Göring was one of the highest-ranking Nazi leaders to be captured alive by the Allies at the end of World War II. In November of 1945, he, along with the other Nazi senior leadership, were put on trial in Nuremberg, a city that was once the epicenter for Nazi propaganda rallies. The Allies chose it deliberately, so the trials there would mark the symbolic end of the Third Reich. And one of the biggest mysteries of the trial is how Göring managed to cheat the hangman. On the night before his hanging, he bit into a cyanide capsule that he managed to conceal from the guards. Nobody knows whether he had it on him all along, or if one of the guards might have slipped it to him. Whatever the source of the cyanide was, it's still one of the great unanswered questions of the Nuremberg trials. Hermann Göring was the Reichsmarshal of the German Luftwaffe, and for years he was considered Hitler's officially designated successor. He started off as a reconnaissance pilot in World War I, and would later become one of the most decorated German pilots of the war, having shot down 22 enemy planes. He was even appointed to lead the celebrated No. 3 Air Squadron Group, after its own commander, the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, had been shot down and killed in action in 1918. In those days, fighter pilots had an incredible amount of aura. They were celebrated in the media at the time as Knights of the Air. Göring's reputation as a decorated pilot gave him instant respect and admiration across Germany. That's part of the reason why he was able to rise in the ranks of the Nazi Party so quickly. And he was the obvious choice as the head of the Luftwaffe once it was established in 1935. Göring liked to portray himself as a kind of Renaissance man, as an art collector and as a hunter. He was already a small-time art collector in the 1920s, but by the outbreak of World War II and the eventual conquest of Poland, France, and other European countries, it opened up the possibility for limitless expansion of his art collection. He didn't know very much about art, so he employed experts to scour Europe for paintings, sculptures, jewelry, even fragments of ancient Roman buildings, and would use these things to furnish his various houses and castles. Most notably Karen Hall, which he intended to repurpose as an art museum after the war. Visitors to Karen Hall would also be startled by the African lion which Göring kept on the grounds, and he often liked to pose for pictures with. He had an arrangement with Dr. Lutz Heck, the director of the Berlin Zoo, so when any of the lions he had grew too big, he would simply have them replaced with a new one. All in all, there were 7 lions that Göring kept in succession. They were kept in a cage on his estate, and he had zookeepers to take care of them, but he would also let them roam around freely when guests arrived. This was all part of Göring's carefully cultivated public image. It went along with his hunting lifestyle that he liked to portray. He even held the title Reichsjägermeister, or Reich Master of the Hunt. Throughout the war, Göring had a tendency to overestimate the capabilities of the Luftwaffe and underestimate his opponents. He would make very grand promises and rarely deliver. He was at times almost delusional, and that could have partly been due to his crippling morphine addiction that he developed after getting shot in the leg during the beer hall putsch of 1925. During the Battle of Britain, he promised Hitler the Luftwaffe would crush the RAF and give them air superiority to start a full-scale invasion of the British Isles. It was nicknamed Operation Sea Lion. But the Royal Air Force proved very difficult to take out for a few reasons. First of all, the RAF was fighting on their home turf. If one of their planes was shot down and the pilot managed to eject, he would most likely land in the countryside somewhere and be picked up by a local or a military vehicle. It was the same case even if they landed in the water. There were plenty of British military and civilian ships that could retrieve the pilots, who would within a few days be back up in another plane again. For the Germans, though, if a good pilot was shot down and survived, he almost certainly would be captured. It was also logistically a lot more difficult for the Germans to get their planes from where they were being manufactured all the way to the front lines compared to the British. And probably one of the biggest factors was the difference in radar technology. It was a huge advantage for the British at the time. And basically the Luftwaffe did not succeed in their mission, and Operation Sea Lion was abandoned. Later in the war, on the Eastern Front, during the Battle of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army, a force of over 250,000 men strong, became surrounded by the Soviets, trapped in the city, and cut off from the German supply lines. They were running out of food, medical supplies, and ammunition. And Göring, as the head of the Luftwaffe, he insisted that he could keep the Sixth Army alive by supplying them all the food and medical supplies they needed by air. But his airlift turned out to be a disaster. The bad weather conditions delayed transport planes, and the Luftwaffe's capabilities were a lot more diminished at this point in the war. It was impossible for them to drop enough supplies to keep the German troops in Stalingrad fed and given all the medical supplies they needed. Many of their wounded ended up left unattended, and many starved. In the end, out of the 250,000 men that were there, 91,000 remained alive and surrendered to the Soviets. The German soldiers who surrendered were forced into makeshift camps across the frozen steppe. Out of those 91,000 soldiers, only around 5,000 would make it back to Germany in the 1950s. The rest of them would perish in the camps. So after Stalingrad, Hitler really never trusted Göring again. The failure of the airlift was seen as his failure, and from that point on, he was more of a figurehead than a real leader. The Luftwaffe kept getting weaker, and the Allies were bombing German cities non-stop, and Göring mostly just slipped into denial and drug addiction while his influence was fading. Then, near the very end of the war, Göring got some confused reports saying that Hitler had a mental breakdown in his Berlin bunker. So he sent a message to the Führer saying that he, Göring, as the official successor, should take power. Hitler took this message as an act of treason and had Göring arrested, stripping him of all his titles and offices. Göring was held under house arrest until the 7th of May 1945, when he tried to reach the American lines, believing that they would see him as the next legitimate leader of Germany after Hitler's death. At first, the American soldiers treated him quite well. They saw him as kind of a famous but controversial figure. But when General Eisenhower heard about this, he was furious, and he ordered Göring to be treated strictly as a prisoner of war with no special privileges. He was forced to remove all his medals and decorations. They wanted to show that he was being treated as a war criminal. They transferred Göring to the Palace Hotel of Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg, codenamed Camp Ashcan. The residents of the prison were known as the Big 21, as they were nicknamed by the guards, and included infamous names. Of course, you had Hermann Göring there, but you also had the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, the former Deputy Führer, Rudolf Hess, and the Supreme Commander of the German Navy, Karl Donitz, who ended up succeeding Hitler in the last few weeks of the war. When Göring was captured, the Americans were shocked by the state of his health. He was only around 5'8" tall, or 173 centimeters, but he weighed 392 pounds, or 118 kilos. He was also still heavily addicted to dihydrocodone, a mild form of morphine that he had been taking, and he was said to have taken around 300 milligrams of it daily. He was in such ill health that the Allies wondered if he would live to the end of the trial. Because of this, they put him on a crash diet and slowly tried to wean him off the morphine. He ended up losing 60 pounds or 27 kilos over the next few months, and this turned out to backfire on the Americans when he was placed on trial at Nuremberg, because the Göring that showed up at trial was a much more mentally sharp version of himself, without the morphine tablets. They did many psychological and other examinations on Göring and the other high-ranking Nazi leaders, and they found that Göring had an IQ of 138, and that explains why he was able to rise to the high rank that he did. Göring was charged with conspiracy, waging a war of aggression, war crimes including plundering and removal of works of art and other property, and crimes against humanity, including the disappearance of political and other opponents, as well as the torture and ill treatment of prisoners of war, and the murder and enslavement of civilians, including what was at the time estimated to be 5.7 million Jews. Göring knew that he would be put to death, but he was determined to go down fighting. He put up a staunch defense in court and pretty much denied everything. He showed himself to be sarcastic, clever, and very difficult to corner in the cross-examinations. The trial would last 11 months, and eventually Göring was sentenced to death by hanging. Göring was content with being put to death. That wasn't a problem for him, but he was angry at the fact that they wanted to hang him. He saw that as a punishment for common criminals, because he saw himself as this kind of aristocratic soldier, even a war hero, and he wanted to die like a soldier by a firing squad, which he saw as a much more heroic way to go. He appealed the decision and demanded that as a former German officer and Reichsmarshal, he should be put to firing squad, but they refused him. The prison was under tight security. It was already expected that some prisoners would try to off themselves, so they were under a 24-hour watch. The prison was dark and extremely cold in the winter. Each month, the guards would rotate between the four allies. You had Americans, British, French, and Soviets. Each group of guards had their own rules and punishments and their own way of treating the prisoners. In the courtroom, the guards had to stand still for hours behind their assigned prisoner. It was a difficult and grueling duty. Some prisoners became friendly with the guards and had a cordial relationship. Most of the prisoners spoke English quite well, including Hermann Göring. Göring was known to sign autographs for some of the guards, sometimes even on things like a dollar bill. And this is what led some people to believe Göring befriending a guard might have been how he managed to obtain a cyanide capsule, which he would use later to end his own life. Göring would leave a letter after his death for the prison governor, Colonel Andros, and he gloated in the letter that every time he entered the courtroom, he had a capsule hidden in his boot, and that he had a second capsule hidden in his cell inside a jar of Nivea cream. So the question is, did he have these capsules on him all along, since before he was even captured? Or did he acquire them while he was in prison? When Göring was captured by the US forces, he had tons of luggage with him and personal belongings, and his baggage was searched for weapons and poison. The luggage would have been sent to Camp Ashcan and then to Nuremberg. The prisoners' baggage was kept locked away inside the prison away from them, but they were allowed to have some personal items like photos, clothes, toiletries in their cell. The cream that he had was some kind of hand cream or ointment and came to the prison in Göring's baggage. It's unlikely that the guards wouldn't have checked inside the cream. The cyanide that they found in his cell was in a glass vial, concealed in a brass rifle cartridge-looking case. It would have been hard to hide this from the guards for 11 months because it isn't that small. The first theory is that Göring had the cyanide on him all along, and the guards simply missed the jar of ointment or wherever he was hiding this rifle cartridge that he had the cyanide in. The second theory is that he obtained the cyanide while he was in prison, possibly from a guard who smuggled it into Göring, maybe sympathizing for him and wanting to give him more of a painless way out. There was a guard named Captain Jack Willis. He was an American officer who seemed to get along well with Göring. Willis drew a lot of suspicion because he received numerous souvenir gifts of personal items, such as a watch, a gold pen, a cigarette case, all of these from the former head of the Luftwaffe. And he was the one that was initially suspected of providing the cyanide that Göring would use to cheat the hangman. The suspicion of Jack Wheelis continued for nearly 60 years, until 2005, when a former US Army private named Herbert Lee Stivers gave a detailed story and confessed that when he was there at the trial on duty, only aged 19, he was a young and gullible soldier, and he explained how he was duped by an attractive German girl that he was dating at the time, and inadvertently passed what she told him was medicine to Göring. If his story is true, it would clear the suspicion around Jack Wheelis and thus clearing his name. At the same time, this could have been Stivers just trying to insert himself into history. Unfortunately, just 8 years after Göring's death, Wheelis himself died of heart disease and would never get to know this story. The US Army's own investigation back in 1946 concluded that Göring most likely had the cyanide with him all along, probably hidden in his personal belongings from the moment he was captured. But the investigators could never prove it with certainty if some of the guards were involved or not. In the end, Göring never gave them the satisfaction of truly facing justice for his crimes. After he had his day in court, he knew what the outcome was to be. So on the night before his execution, he bit down on the cyanide capsule and avoided the public humiliation and the spectacle of the gallows. And so, in his own twisted way, Göring had the last laugh. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.